Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. We said we were going to do different formats for the summer, and then things happened. And sometimes it turns out the format that you were using for a while is the best one. So for a couple of these episodes, we're going to be going back to the long form interview conversations because that's the best way to flesh out all the information that we need to flesh out. Tonight is going to be one of those. And this is so cool. I'm going to be such a geek for this episode because we're talking about an issue tonight that has to do with a pretty, it could be perceived as niche, but I personally don't think it is. I think it has some pretty big ramifications. I think it has some pretty big implications to find out whether or not I'm right about my suspicions, as well as to learn a whole lot of things I already know that I don't know. I am extremely excited to welcome to the show. And yeah, I'm going to throw it in front there. Dr. Sarah Elmeligi, who's also, I'm told, a little bit involved in the politics. Welcome to the show, Dr. Maligi.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's my pleasure to be here, Nate.
So, I mean, first of all, full disclosure, you are an NDP MLA for
Yeah,
Kananaskis,
yeah.
which is fine. It's good to have elected representation. But I want to be really clear to our audience. We're not, and no disrespect intended to your elected position. My interest in talking with you tonight has far less to do with the fact that you're an MLA or an NDP MLA. It has to do with the stunning amount of knowledge and experience that you bring to bear on this particular subject.
Oh my gosh, that is like the worst pun ever.
There's going to be a couple of these. So
Okay, good,
we're
good.
we're talking about bears tonight.
Yep, we
Uh,
are.
we're talking particularly for now, he said cautiously, we're talking about grizzly bears.
Yeah.
So let's turn back the clock a couple of months before the impetus for this conversation became a thing. Um, Actually, before we do that, I alluded to a bunch of stuff and then I didn't let you run through your CV, which was a
Okay.
very unprofessional move on my part. So when I say that you're bringing a boatload of experience and knowledge, could you expand on that, please?
Sure. So, as you said, I am currently the MLA for Banff Kananaskis. But before I chose this strange and interesting path into politics, I was working as a bear biologist, landscape ecologist, here in Southern Alberta for really almost, I've been saying 15 years, but I realized the other day it's close to 20. So I did my master's and my PhD research, really looking at how grizzly bears share a landscape with recreationists and how they use habitat around people, or don't in some cases, and how they move through the landscape around people. But I also always applied what's called an interdisciplinary approach to my research. The biggest part of bear management is really people management. And so I always incorporated a survey with visitors or recreationists and try and understand what their expectations of management was and what kinds of management options would they be most willing to support, whether that's in the national parks or provincial parks or public lands or whatever. Because I really think it's about bears and people. So when we have this conversation, we need to talk about both bears and people. And then outside of academia, I've worked for environmental nonprofit organizations. I've worked for Alberta Parks, really looking at the large landscape and how we plan human activities or developments on that landscape in bear habitat, to make sure that bears are safe and survive and thrive, and that people survive and thrive and really appreciate the landscape as well. So I've been working in this exact area of human bear coexistence for a really long time before I was a politician. And to be honest, Nate, it's one of the reasons why I went into politics, because I began to see and appreciate as an academic and as somebody working on land use planning that there he is. there's the big
Perfect.
Dane poking his face in. I began to really appreciate how you don't want these to be politicized decisions, but at the end of the day, it's the minister that makes the decision on a lot of this stuff. And And so politics does have a role to play in bear management, especially with grizzly bears, because a lot of people have really strong feelings about it, right? So
And you literally, to be clear, you literally wrote the book on this topic, yeah?
yeah, so I wrote a book. I mean, there are multiple books, but I did write a book a few years ago called What Bears Teach Us, where I partnered with my really good friend and amazing wildlife photographer, John Marriott. And I wrote the book and it's his photos. And I really wanted to create a book that sort of combined the science and like wildlife management principles and science with photos and stories about bear behavior. So when you're out in the field, like really like living with bears and seeing them and watching them grow up and interacting with them or not interacting with them every day, you see things about them. You see their personalities and you end up with these really cool stories. And a lot of that stuff doesn't end up in data. It's not in a graph that this cool little bear ran away from a porcupine one day. Uh, but it was a really fun thing to see, and it was really interesting. And you learn a lot about bears just by hanging out with them. And so I wanted to write a book that kind of combined all of that and help people understand that bears, regardless of the species, are really complex animals with big brains. They think, they make decisions, they learn over time, and they all have personalities, right? So what one bear thinks is okay, another bear might not think is okay. And so John and I partnered on What Bears Teach Us, which is, I don't know, one of the coolest things I've done in my career. If I can be honest, I really like the book a lot.
I got to ask before we get into the conversation, where can people get the book?
So Rocky Mountain Books was the publisher for our book. So you can order it online through RMB, RockyMountainBooks.com, or it should be available anywhere books are sold, or they can order it in for you. So if you have a local bookstore or, anywhere that you buy books, you can buy What Bears Teach Us.
Perfect. I wanted to make sure that we got that plug in the way before I
Thanks.
forgot, because like I said, I'm gonna geek out a lot on this episode.
I love geeking out about bears, so we have that in common already.
There we go. Um, let's start with the question that I was going to ask before I realized, oh, hey, we should actually talk about the incredible amount of qualifications that you're bringing to the table. I won't use the same pun twice, I promise. Um, what was prior to the impetus for this conversation? What was the state of, and let's just focus on the grizzly bears because that's where the impetus is. What was the state of the grizzly bear situation in Alberta?
Yeah, so I mean, it's hard to know how far back to go, right? Like we have a long history with grizzly bears, arguably going back to the 1800s, and for First Nations on this land, it goes back, to time immemorial, right? So we have always had this interesting relationship with grizzly bears that balances or doesn't balance sometimes conflict and coexistence and sharing space and not sharing space. So I'll just go back to 2006 because that's when the grizzly bear hunt in Alberta was moratorium was put in place. So a lot of people worked really hard to put a moratorium on the hunt because they felt like the population of grizzly bears in Alberta was at such a level that it couldn't sustain a hunt anymore. In 2010, I was actually part of a team of people from the environmental community that mobilized Albertans to get the government to list grizzly bears as threatened under the Alberta Wildlife Act. And that campaign and that decision was really based on the current population numbers we had at the time, suggesting that we had less than 800 individual grizzly bears in the province, and anything less than 1,000 adult bears is considered threatened by the International Union of the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN. So the IUCN defines international standards of threatened and endangered, and our grizzly bear population data was suggesting was in this threatened category. That listing in 2010 also really created impetus and motivation to get more accurate population numbers. And over the years, some of the best bear biologists in the world who happen to be in Alberta, and colleagues of mine who are just some of the smartest people I've ever known, really engaged in one of the most comprehensive DNA population estimates ever undertaken for a large carnivore in North America. And that happened right here in Alberta. Those population numbers we actually have for some. Alberta is split into these bear management units, right? Like they're chunks of Alberta where we say, most of them are separated by the east-west highways, like Yellowhead to Highway 11 to Highway 1 to Highway 3. And those are just units. It breaks it up for us to better understand management. And so, over that time from 2010 to 2018, 2017, some populations, some bear management units, we actually sampled twice during that time. And so we were able to show that over that time, in some parts of the province, the grizzly bear population has increased. In other parts of the province, the grizzly bear population is maintained stable. And in other parts of the province, we don't know because we don't have accurate before and after data yet. That information was used to create an updated, what's called a status report, which still has not been publicly released. But those updated population numbers were reflected in the released Alberta Government Grizzly Bear Recovery Plan, which was released in 2020, I believe, the last one. And so those population numbers are the ones that people might be seeing that show that we have somewhere between 850 and 950, 960 grizzly bears in the province of Alberta. Still below that 1,000 individual threshold. And let's also remember, our population estimate is all bears, all grizzly bears, regardless of age. That 1,000 individual threshold is 1,000 reproducing individuals. So it is not including cubs or subadults that are not yet of reproductive age. So we still have a grizzly bear population in Alberta that is threatened. It still falls below this magical 1,000 number threshold. And so that means that we have a provincial grizzly bear recovery plan that has been created and vetted and drafted by experts based on science, based on public and stakeholder consultation. And it is approved by the government, and it is supposed to serve as the guiding document for grizzly bear management across Alberta. And so hopefully that kind of gives you a sense of like where we've come on paper and kind of how that conversation has gone. Where we've come from in terms of like human bear coexistence, I think it's nice to zoom that conversation out even a little bit more and talk about how we talk about human bear conflict in this world of bear biology and bear ecology. So, for example, we talk about coexistence now instead of conflict. And you can have, if you, the lack of coexistence is conflict. Get it? We also say human bear conflict or human bear coexistence instead of problem bears or nuisance bears, because that terminology recognizes that people are part of the problem and the solution, and actually that humans cause the problem and the solution. So that's one of the reasons why we start talking more about human bear coexistence instead of problem bears or nuisance bears. And you'll notice that the minister is not using that same language. I
Before
noticed
we get into the minister piece, I have a couple things that I want to clarify. Um, how come that report was never released publicly? Do we know why? Because like
that.
if if it was done in 2019,
Oh, I think it might have been completed in 2020,
okay.
2022 even. It's not that old, but it has been just waiting for final ministerial approval and release for at least a couple of years.
Well, there's the problem then. Okay. It's so the big takeaways that I have from that are we're still less than the 1,000 bears who can reproduce if they choose to. Now I'm also curious, like to me, and I could be wrong, and this is one of the things that I wanted to clarify. Like I can give you my address, I'm not going to because strange people would show up at my house, but I could.
Yeah, please
I
don't.
have I have a feeling that bears don't do that, and I would be willing to bet the area that a bear moves in is not small, especially when we're talking about the bigger bears. So, like for context, how big of an area does an animal like a grizzly bear occupy,
Yeah.
migrate through? I don't know.
Yeah, so grizzly bears have what are called home ranges, which is like a territory, let's say, and they have overlapping home ranges. So if you were to look at a map of all of the grizzly bear home ranges, they'd all be all these funky little shapes and sizes, and they would like overlay each other in parts, but they all have like their own space where nobody else is. Um, and so they're you got to think about them constantly kind of like moving around this landscape, sometimes interacting with each other, maybe only like smelling each other, like seeing a marked tree and knowing that the other one had passed by recently or whatever. I think that sometimes grizzly bears spend a lot more time together than we think that they do because like we're not watching all of them 24 hours a day, but they can occupy really vast areas of land, which is why we sometimes call grizzly bears umbrella species, because if you can protect habitat for grizzly bears, you kind of just end up protecting a lot of other things that need that same space. So you might hear people talk about grizzly bears in that way. It also depends on how old they are. So young bears have smaller home ranges, older bears tend to have larger home ranges. Females have smaller home ranges, males have larger home ranges. But an adult male grizzly bear in Alberta can occupy 350 square kilometers. It's a lot. And you think about what that means in the context of something like the Eastern Slopes. Like we've got bears here, I live in the Bow Valley in Canmore. We have bears here that have territory that overlaps a national park, provincial public lands, the town of Canmore, uh, like private lands out potentially way out on the Eastern Slopes where there could be grazing leases and the ghost and cattle and all kinds of things. So grizzly bears are really in Alberta, they're occupying potentially a very complex landscape where I like to say it's like we've written this really complex rule book for how bears can be good bears, and they can't read English. So we've written this really complex book, and then we're just like, here you go. So how a bear is treated in the national park could be very different from the provincial park, from public lands to private lands, to more of an urban setting. And that is one of the reasons why it's so hard to be a grizzly bear in Alberta, is that the rules are not consistent. But fortunately, bears are really smart and they learn over time. And so they can kind of figure out which parts of their home range might be quieter or safer or less intense from a human development perspective.
I realize I should have asked this earlier for context. How big? Like, I mean, I've seen some absolutely, I would call them terrifying with good reason videos. I have had the privilege of viewing a grizzly bear from an incredibly long distance, and I was still kind of like, I don't know, man. Because they're not small. How big of an animal are we talking about?
Well, it really depends on where they live. So, grizzly bears, like all bears, are really food driven. And the higher the protein and the fat content of their food, the bigger they tend to be. So, some of these videos that people might see of grizzly bears that are like just like really, really, really big bears. Most of those bears are probably in Alaska or the west coast of BC, where they've got salmon. And salmon changes everything, right? They just eat so much fat and so much protein. They are just really large animals. And so it might not be uncommon in that part of the world to have a male grizzly bear who's 800 to 1,000 pounds. Here, we don't have salmon and we don't have that same kind of high protein and fat content. So, bears are like a really big bear in Alberta is like 500 to 600 pounds.
Which is still like that's a lot of animal.
Oh yeah, and make no mistake, like we were talking about this before, you started recording, but you said the scariest bear for you is like a baby bear. The scariest
100%.
bear for me is a subadult bear. They only weigh like maybe 130 pounds, but they're like running around trying to prove themselves to everybody all the time. And they don't have a mom anymore, and they're just like teenagers. Like my 18-year-old teenage daughter also scares me sometimes. and she's a human. So yeah, like for me, I feel the most nervous if I run into a subadult grizzly bear by itself. I'm like, well, okay. That's for me, that's always the one that's the least predictable bear.
That's
So
fair. For
yeah,
for for context, if you could, I mean, I think I explained it, and I think you probably knew it before I even said it. But
I'm just gonna let Max out here.
yeah, by all means. Bye, Max.
All right, I closed that door, so he won't be interrupting us anymore.
That's
So
all
good.
good. Um, for context though, uh, why is it like you know why I say the most terrifying bear to me is a baby bear. We see the pictures. Why should people not look at baby bears and go, I want to snuggle that?
Yeah. So first I'll say it's a very normal reaction to look at a baby bear and want to cuddle it. I want to cuddle them all the time. They're super duper cute.
They're super cute.
Yeah, and this is one of the things about grizzly bears that's so interesting, or all bears, is like you either grow up with this perception that they're super cute and cuddly and a playful, like Yogi Bear, friendly, like Smokey the Bear, or they're just like vicious man-eating, bloodthirsty machines out there on the landscape wanting to just like wreak havoc and destroy everything, right? Like if you look up grizzly bears on Google Images, those are the two pictures you see, super cute or super violent. The reality is that all bears obviously exist in this space in between. Uh, Grizzly bears and all bears, sadly, practice what's called infanticide. So a male grizzly bear will kill cubs to bring a female into estrus so that he can mate with her. And so this is one of the reasons why bears have evolved, that people say, like, you're like a mama bear, because a mama bear has evolved to protect her cubs from a male bear. Right. And so this is one of the reasons why, yeah, when you see cubs, your first thought should be like, where's the mom? Oh my God, how do I get out of here? Because you don't want to trigger a defensive attack because the mom feels like you're a threat to her cubs. So that is one of the reasons why, definitely don't want to cuddle baby cubs. And if you see baby bears, I actually just think if you see a bear, period, like just don't be there.
Yeah.
Like just get out of the way.
And this is going to be part of the conversation that we're going to get to later because I
Yeah.
think that's a huge misperception that exists. Like people want to, oh, I want to get a picture of the bear. Oh, I want to get like unless you've got one hell of a telephoto, not a great choice. Um,
Well, this is also one of the reasons why I wrote the book, right? Because we tend to look at these encounters from the human perspective. But if you think about it from the bear's perspective, you might not behave the same way. Like you might be more willing to give that bear space if you could just appreciate that Alberta is an incredibly hard landscape to survive as a bear. Most bears don't even make it to sexual maturity in Alberta. So when we think about it from the bear's perspective, we may be more willing to recreate on another trail that day, or perhaps just go back to the car and go get a coffee, or maybe not try to get closer to the bear to take the best photo ever. So that's one of the reasons why I wrote What Bears Teach Us, because I think one of the things that bears teach us is really like how to think a little differently.
And yeah, that's the big takeaway that I really hope that people get from today's show is that, to me, the metaphor that I use anytime there's any kind of interaction with wildlife is like, whose terms is this on? Because if like somebody just showed up in my front yard and just stood there, I'd have some questions.
Right? Or like if you were just having lunch one day and suddenly a whole bunch of paparazzi were like crowding over you trying to take your picture, and you're just like eating dandelions in the ditch, like, well, how would you
We all
feel?
do.
I wouldn't like it very much.
They're bitter from experience, he said.
Yeah.
So that's a whole bunch of context that I think is really, really important.
Yeah.
And I want to just clarify the best data that we have
Yeah.
is that we still do not have a grizzly bear population in Alberta that is above that 1,000 bear mark
Mhm.
uh, that would the experts, the international bear folks, would say, no, it's cool.
Yeah.
We're still in that threatened territory. Correct.
Yes. Yes. On Alberta lands. You may have noticed that the minister is throwing around this like 1150 number, that our bear population's at 1150. I don't know where that number comes from. I don't know where that data comes from. I don't know if he's including bear population estimates for the national parks. I mean, maybe, but we don't manage the bears in the national parks. That's up to Parks Canada. So the best data that we have for Alberta lands of bears that we manage is still well under 1,000 individuals, or well, not well under. It's like 980 at the most.
Okay, so said the bear expert, that's good enough for me. I mean, I I don't need to try to challenge that. So we've got this new thing that's happening, and
Mhm.
I'm hoping that you can talk a little bit about what the new thing is and what the explanation for the new thing is, because I'm still at a loss. Like, I don't know if there's been like a sudden uptick in heists of picnic baskets, or what, but what's the new thing?
Yeah. So I found out through a colleague that on the Saturday of the Canada Day long weekend, in the Alberta Gazette, which is like a kind of a newsletter that goes around to government employees and MLAs, that there had been some regulatory changes made to the Alberta Wildlife Act. A minister can change regulations anytime. Like, it's totally within the authority of the minister to do this. It's just kind of interesting because people really care about grizzly bears, and I think it's kind of funny that I'm not sure if he anticipated that people would care so much, but anyway, these regulations, these changes to the Wildlife Act basically enable hunters or anybody in Alberta with a hunting license to kill what is called a problem bear. So, as I said, I don't like that terminology, but let's say that's fine. So basically what that is if you have a bear on your property that has engaged in conflict and, like, let's say has killed a calf or, has caused damage somehow, your normal response as a landowner is to call Fish and Wildlife and say, I have a conflict bear. And Fish and Wildlife comes out and they will assess the situation. And they have a whole array of management tools at their disposal. They can haze the bear, they can do nothing, they can help you control the attractant, they can relocate or translocate the bear if they deem that that's necessary, or in extreme cases, they can euthanize the bear. These regulations enable that Fish and Wildlife officer to make the decision of, I'm going to euthanize the bear. I'm not going to be the one to pull the trigger. I'm going to engage an Alberta hunter who wants to kill a bear, can now come down here. The hunter will have 24 hours to show up on site and track and kill that problem grizzly bear. So this is not a grizzly bear hunt. The minister has been quite clear about that, and I agree. It's not a hunt. It's a free-for-all. It's worse than a hunt. A hunt would come with a limited number of tags, and there's an established process for what that looks like. This isn't a hunt. This is a whole new process. This is creating a pool of Albertans with a hunting license who just want to kill a grizzly bear, and then saying, hey, guess what? There's a grizzly bear here that needs to be killed. We're going to randomly select somebody and you can come down here and kill it. These people from the public who can sign up for what's called these bear management authorizations or wildlife management authorizations, there's no requirements. There's no minimum criteria of their skill or proficiency as a hunter. They just need to be over 18 and have a hunting license. And I'll just add, Nate, that the email inviting all hunters to sign up for these wildlife management authorizations went out today. And I know this because my husband is a hunter. And so I'm not against hunting. I mean, I love it when there's a deer in our freezer. But hunting is something that is managed and planned based on scientific data and population estimates. This destruction or euthanasia of grizzly bears that are engaged in very intense levels of conflict. is not hunting. It's something that should be done by trained fish and wildlife professionals only. And to open that up to the public, I think creates a whole slew of risks for bears and for people that I'm very, very uncomfortable with. And it's also, I just don't like it. I just hate everything about it.
You gave me
Um,
so much to unpack there. So I'm going to jump in and try to
yeah,
unpack some of
yeah,
it
yeah.
because uh, I have questions. I'm going to start with something a little light. Uh, how does one haze a bear? Like, do you wake it up when it's sleeping with loud music? Do you force it to go out into the middle of the university and do a dance? Or like, what is hazing a bear?
Yeah, lots of keg stands.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
no, that's not how. So basically, there's a thing called aversive conditioning or hazing, where you basically provide a negative stimulus for the bear when it engages in certain behavior. And you're basically the same way I train my dog not to sit on the couch, even though when I'm not home, he sits on the couch anyway. Right? So hazing and aversive conditioning is quite staff intensive because it is like training an animal. Like when you come here, this negative stimulus happens. And that negative stimulus, like in Kananaskis, in around the campgrounds, they've been doing this incredible aversive conditioning program for over 20 years. And it can be like bean bags thrown, like shot at the bear. We used to use paintballs, but we don't anymore because it leaves a mark and people don't like to see bears with like paintball marks on them. It can also be with dogs. And so there are some breeds of dogs like Great Pyrenees, Karelian bear dogs that are bred for protecting cattle and livestock from bears. So, we could also have programs where we work with landowners to help them secure dogs and have dogs to protect their livestock. I mean, dogs have been protecting sheep from wolves for like, I don't know, it feels like hundreds and hundreds of years, right? Same principle here. So basically, it's like you want to try to make the bear feel so uncomfortable that it's not worth them sticking around.
I want to dig into um the I'm sorry. Like and again, when you said it, my brain just went away because I'm not a hunter myself. I certainly grew up in an environment where hunting was ubiquitous. I don't have an issue with anyone who's harvesting animals responsibly for the purposes of the foodstuffs. I think game hunters are dicks, and I don't have a problem saying that. Like sport game hunters, I'm going to go kill a giraffe so I can prove what a big man I am. Like you're an asshole. Period. That's just my feelings on it. But there's no requirements for proficiency.
No.
Are there any requirements at all? Because like
Well, you have to have a hunting license.
that's it.
Yeah, and you have to be over 18.
That's the dumbest thing I think I've ever heard. And I hear some dumb things fairly regularly. Is
Yeah.
there any mention of any so here's the question that I'm getting at because I've spent a lot of time with people who hunt and I know that one of the biggest things that pisses off proficient hunters is incompetent hunters because
Mhm.
not only do they do a garbage job of hunting but they actually inflict unnecessary harm.
Yep.
uh, there's proficiency when using firearms. You have to be able to hit the right spots, otherwise you're going to potentially make the animal suffer a whole bunch, or you could just really piss it off. And that's not something I'd want to be doing with a grizzly bear. So there's no requirements for the types of um, weapons that are being utilized here. Like, could somebody go chase after a bear with a club and learn like FAFO the hard way?
There are not as far as the regulations define. So no, there are no requirements of the weapon or their level of ability to use it, their accuracy. Um, Also, just let's go back. You asked how big of a space bears occupy. A bear can travel like 50 kilometers in 24 hours if it's highly motivated, right? So the Fish and Wildlife officer comes out, sees this bear. The bear probably it's freaked out by now. Maybe the bear takes off. And now somebody has 24 hours to come and track down and shoot that bear. And I think one of the biggest risks of these regulations is that they get the wrong bear.
Well, that was my next question because
Yeah.
like I don't imagine they leave calling cards or like hey, I'll meet you at um how 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 do you know that you're getting the right like I'll put it this way. Let's say that I'm a trained proficient fish and wildlife officer. There's been a bear that's identified that needs to be euthanized. How do I know as a fish and wildlife officer that I'm getting the right bear?
So there's a few different things that fish and wildlife officers do. So in extreme cases, like where somebody has been killed, or really, really, really hurt in a bear attack, the fish and wildlife officers may decide if they get there and the bear is no longer in the area, they can set up a trap. And then they can extract DNA from the individual in the trap and compare that to the wounds on the human and be 100% sure that they have caught the right bear. And then they humanely euthanize that animal. So there is significant training that goes into this kind of response. And right now, like I just, while we're talking, pulled up the grizzly bear recovery plan. And from 2010 to 2015, so over a 5-year period, 10 grizzly bears were euthanized for extreme conflict. So the data really shows we're talking about 2 to 3 grizzly bears per year that kind of end up being euthanized because of significant damage to livestock or people. It's not a tremendous number of bears. The minister has been running around saying we're killing 20 bears a year. I don't even know where that number comes from. I feel like it just came out of the air. It's not based on any data that I've ever seen. We're talking about 2 to 3 bears a year. So there's not this like crazy onerous capacity requirement on fish and wildlife staff that we really need the public's help to manage this. That's not the case out there. When a bear attacks somebody significantly or kills a bunch of livestock or kills someone, fish and wildlife respond with their training and their expertise and tools at their disposal that do not exist for the average person in the public, right? And I already have questions sometimes about the training of fish and wildlife officers that respond to these cases. There have been occasions in the past where I feel like they've been pretty quick on the euthanasia spectrum. Uh, but all of that aside, it doesn't even matter because they've had some training. Somebody from the public has had none.
So is
You
there
have
like
to assume that they've had none.
yeah, is there well, I mean, if we're euthanizing 2 to 3 like 1 to 2 grizzly bears a year and those
Two to three,
okay, 2 to 3
for sure.
and those are being euthanized by fish and game folks, I feel like, and I could be wrong, there's not a lot of average Albertans who have experience hunting grizzly bears because A, you can't, and B, it's done by fish and wildlife officers. So at least since the moratorium, I think you said it was in 2010,
Mhm.
um, there's nobody who would have any experience doing that thing in Alberta unless they traveled elsewhere. Am I right?
Not legally. I mean, grizzly bears are still poached. So there's still quite a bit of grizzly bear poaching that happens. So they could have experience that way. There's also like what's called mistaken identity deaths every year. So that's really somebody who has a license to hunt black bear and shoots a grizzly bear by mistake. And of course, there are always self-defense mortalities too. Typically, those tend to happen usually in the fall when people are hunting elk or deer, and a bear is just like waiting for that free meat opportunity. So usually you'll see more self-defense kills around that time. And that's, a hunter out there on the land protecting themselves from a charging bear. But all of those are relatively rare also. But none of those kinds of mortality are being targeted by these new regulations either. Like these regulations are about a grizzly bear has come onto your land and has killed a cow, and you don't feel safe about it, and you want Fish and Wildlife decides that the bear should be euthanized, and now they're going to pull somebody in from the public to do it.
I just that I'm spending way too much time on recent interview episodes ending up speechless because it just blows.
Well, wait, I haven't even told you the best part, Nate. The best part of this is that it won't work.
We'll get to
So,
that.
yeah.
Um, I want to clarify one other thing, just because
Yeah.
this would be the only thing that would make it sound slightly sane. Is there any requirement that's been identified so far that says, let's say a problem, and I'm air quoting the hell out of that, a problem bear has been identified, um, and Timmy won the, I'm not going to say what I was going to say there. He won the lottery. Um, so he gets to go hunt this bear for 24 hours. Like, this is sounding like
No, he
almost,
has to be on site within 24 hours. So,
and
this
then he gets
bear
to
could
hunt he
be like
wants.
it's somewhere on the eastern slopes, and maybe the person drawn from the pool, randomly selected apparently, from the pool lives up by Grand Prairie, right? So they would have 24 hours to come to the site where the conflict occurred, and then can not hunt the grizzly bear from there.
And is there any requirements in the legislation or the regulations that says, and they will be accompanied by a fish and wildlife officer? Or is it just go get him, Timmy? It's go get him,
Yeah,
Timmy.
there's nothing in here that says the Fish and Wildlife Officer needs to accompany them. The minister has also been quoted as saying like this frees up capacity for our fish and wildlife officers who are pretty strapped and really busy, which I do believe is true. I do believe that our fish and wildlife officers are very busy on the landscape. I do believe we should have more fish and wildlife officers on the landscape, working with people around wildlife conflict. In this particular situation, these regulations don't say that the fish and wildlife officer will accompany the person. It just says they will they will go. They will get a grizzly bear management authorization, and then they're just kind of allowed to go out there and kill that grizzly bear.
I mean, obviously, I have some strong feelings about the current provincial government, and I'd argue they've done some pretty dumb things. We may have a new, just for like, this is how you choose to execute this. This might be one of the dumbest. Like, I'm a little bit speechless because the notion that any idiot with a hunting license who has no experience hunting is going to go and try to hunt one of the, I would argue probably, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the apex predator short of people in the province of Alberta and just hope for the best. Like, I am hard pressed to think of something that is more irresponsible, because the question that I have right out of the gates is, let's say that Timmy wins the lottery and he goes out there with his 22 and he pisses off the bear, and a pissed off bear crosses paths with a hiker or somebody else. Who's on the hook for that?
I mean, like I think you have to be careful because like I've gone down this rabbit hole of like hypothetical situations. None of them have answers because they're not in the regulations. So
So we don't have
uh
an answer for that.
yeah, so there's no way to answer that question because I don't really know because it's not in here. And this really, for me, Nate, this is one of the reasons why consulting with experts before you release regulations like this is so critical. So in Alberta, we have a grizzly bear recovery, Alberta Grizzly Bear Recovery Plan, which I've mentioned a few times. There is a team of experts who wrote that and reviewed that. So there's an Alberta Grizzly Bear Recovery team. There's the Endangered Species Conservation Committee, not to mention the dozens of bear biologists that are Alberta trained, living, like myself included. I don't need to be consulted. I'm an MLA now, right? Like I don't expect that the minister is going to come and ask me what I think, although it would have been nice if he did. But I'm like one of dozens of experts on grizzly bears and human bear coexistence in Alberta. And none of those people were consulted or asked about the changes to these regulations. So that to me shows a real lack of consideration for the implications that can arise from this, and also just a complete like disrespect of the many people who've contributed like years and years of their careers to researching and understanding this exact challenge facing wildlife management in Alberta. And for a minister to just make these recommendations and pretend like those people aren't there, that all that science isn't there, that all of that work over decades hasn't happened, is just, it's disrespectful and so highly inappropriate. Like, when we become politicians, and I include myself in this, we really have a responsibility to Albertans to admit that there's a lot that we don't know. And it is our job to consult with experts to make sure that when we make decisions, we are making decisions based on data and evidence, regardless of what field that is from, that we have experts driving the decisions that we're making so that we can have confidence in the effectiveness of those decisions. And I can tell you right now that these regulations were not based on science, they were not based on data, and they were not based on any kind of recommendation from any expert. And I know because I've talked to them all, because those were the first calls I made when I read this. It was like calling my colleagues and being like, what is this? And none of us knew about it. So to me, it's just like, it's a complete, it really, the UCP is not known for its effective public consultation. And this is just yet another example of them making a huge decision and not really consulting with people about its implications or its impact or its appropriateness even.
Here's my next question, and I promise we'll get to the it's not going to work part because that to me is I would normally call that a punchline if it just wasn't so tragic, but it it seems to me burying the lead on this one a little bit, but it seems to me that if you're going to create a program where you say, hey, anybody in Alberta who's over 18 who has a hunting license, you can win the um the opportunity to go kill, hunt. I don't what was the terminology the minister used again?
Their management
You can
authorizations.
go manage a grizzly bear to death,
Yeah.
which sounds like the worst episode of The Office ever, but you can go manage a grizzly bear. Um, it seems to me that they're creating an opportunity for if I'm Timmy and the best that I've done is I've gotten a couple of I don't know deer or something easy with my you know completely underpowered weapon for the purposes that we're talking about. It seems to me that you're creating an opportunity for somebody to go, hey, Timmy, you know what? Hunting grizzly bears is actually really quite challenging. You need the right weapons and you need the right guidance. For only $10,000, we'll provide you with a guide and the gun and the things and the three skidoos that you're going to need to get this animal out of the woods. What do you say? It seems to me like there's an opportunity that's been created intentionally or unintentionally. And I'm just curious, are you aware of anybody who might have a vested interest in a program like that?
Well, like I said, we can't go too far down the hypothetical rabbit hole, right? Because some of it really depends on how it plays out. I know that you're hinting at the fact that the minister used to have an ownership or a vested interest in a hunting guide outfitting business. That has been reviewed by the ethics commissioner, and he took a step back from it in some way or another to satisfy the ethics commissioner, and has said that there's not a conflict of interest there. However, I will say that I'm still very concerned about a conflict of interest there. Like, it's not only the businesses that you directly own or participate in when you're a politician, it's the biases that you bring to the table through the people that expect things of you. And I think we all as politicians need to be very careful about playing to our favorites and playing to our base. Right? It's a very easy thing for people to latch onto and accuse us of. And this is why decisions should be made through formal consultation and discussion with experts. Because I do believe that we all come to this role with our own individual biases. and perceptions. And one of the reasons why I wanted to go into politics was because I was feeling really frustrated that wildlife science and wildlife management experts were not informing political decision making. These don't have to be subjective decisions. There is plenty of data to inform them. In this particular case, that data is in the Grizzly Bear Recovery Plan, which has a whole slew of recommendations to recover grizzly bears in Alberta. A large portion of those deal with reducing human-bear conflict. And those recommendations are about getting out on the land and working with people to reduce their attractants, making sure they feel safe, bears are safe, and that we develop more of a culture of coexistence than just trying to shoot our way out of wildlife management challenges. And that approach of just like, we'll just shoot it is like, it's archaic, it's needless, and it is not based on data. And this is why politicians need to consult with experts, because we don't all know everything, right? And that was one of the reasons why I was even interested in running, because I was like, somebody needs to bring some data into that world.
I think it's also important to highlight, one of the worst kept secret, well, poorly known secrets, it's not a great kept secret either, is that when we talk about the ethics commissioner, that is probably one of the most poorly named job titles in government, because the ethics commissioner can only act within the Conflicts of Interest Act. And when it comes to actually policing true legitimate conflicts of interest, that act is so weak sauce. If it was an actual sauce that you were tasting, you'd be like, is there tomato? Am I just drinking water? It is a incredibly weak performative act. So when people say this is, and we have some experience with that act on the show. When people say, "Oh, the ethics commissioner has taken a look and there's no conflict of interest," that is within a staggeringly strict set of parameters that most people who have any clue about how ethics work would go, "Oh, that's not nearly good enough." So I just wanted to contextualize that with my own personal bias for a sec there.
Yeah,
Um,
I think you're right, Nate, but I also think this is where Albertans really have a role to play, right? Like the process in with regards to the ethics commissioner, the process has been followed and the outcome has been determined. But that doesn't mean that Albertans don't have the ability to hold their elected officials accountable. If Albertans feel that there is a conflict of interest here, or in any case, they should be asking the politicians about that and kind of holding their feet to the fire a little bit, right? Like, this is how democracy works. When we are elected officials, we represent the people of Alberta. And if the people of Alberta don't think we're doing a good job, then they should tell us.
yeah. The only other thing I'll say about the Conflict of Interest Act and the Ethics Commissioner is this is the same role and legislation that had no issue whatsoever with the recent regulatory changes that were made by the UCP to say, okay, so let's talk about the gifts. This limit. I can't go to any games. I want to go to the games. I want to sit in the owners' boxes. And if you were to take a look at that on its face, most people would go, "Oh, that doesn't smell right. That seems a little politicians for saley. I'm not sure how I feel about that." It There's no trigger in the act to go, "Yeah, that's messed up. This is just a thing that we do now."
Right. So if for those of your listeners or viewers who are super mega nerdy, if you go
Which is
back
most
into
of them, and we're
yeah.
really proud of that.
So if you go back into Hansard or Legislature TV from the fall session, we debated that bill that removed the limit on gifts quite extensively. And, the opposition was opposed to that bill. I'm pretty sure it was Bill 8. And there was two of them. One was for boards and commissions and one was for gifts. But I'm pretty sure the gifts was Bill 8 or maybe Bill 10. Either way, go back to Legislature TV and watch some of those debates if you feel so inclined in our afternoon and evening sessions. There's some really good points made by some of my colleagues in the House. And, we really did not feel that those two pieces of legislation were appropriate. for MLAs, all MLAs, like regardless of partisanship.
Yeah, to me, that's a whole other conversation. But I want to get back
That
to
is,
the cares. So we've got this new industry opportunity that's been potentially created that some people may or may not benefit from. Hard to say. And we've got this strategy where the fish and wildlife officers will determine if it's a problem bear that needs to be managed to death. That's how I'm going to refer to it from now on. Uh, The last thing that I want to talk about before it works is it seems to me there's some vulnerabilities there. Because if I'm a farmer and I'm a hunter and I'm on the list of registered, I'm trying so hard. I'm trying so
you're
hard.
doing great. You're doing great.
Oh, it's a challenge. I'm on the list of registered hunters who want to manage a bear to death. Um, eh, what is to prevent me from accidentally leaving out like stuff that would make a bear a problem bear? What's to stop me from doing that and hoping that maybe I get to win the ticket, or maybe I get to say to the guy who wins the ticket, "Hey, I'll come along and polish your gun or something."
Yeah, so I mean, that is one of the concerns that myself and some of my colleagues have is like, what's to stop somebody from baiting a bear? And nothing, right? Like, this is reliant on the fact that you're just going about your business and suddenly you have a bear who is getting into trouble, and that bear, a fish and wildlife officer deems is, you know, required. I don't even want to say it's like you really need to understand euthanizing a bear is an extreme case scenario. It is not the first decision that fish and wildlife officers jump to, right? So these are really, really extreme cases. These are things that happen very rarely. This is not a bear walked across my land and I felt nervous, or like I saw a bear walk through the campsite, or I saw a bear eating berries next to the campsite. This is not that. This is like this bear killed 8 calves, and this rancher has just lost thousands and thousands of dollars of calves, right? Like we're talking about extreme cases here. And uh, the reason why it is up to Fish and Wildlife to respond is because it adds a little bit more objectivity to the assessment, because Fish and Wildlife officers are trained to assess what has happened and what the appropriate management response is. If you all of a sudden have this pressure for adding, you know, killing a bear in response, that could change the fish and wildlife officer's assessment. Even like, what if their buddy is in the pool and wants to shoot a grizzly bear? Like, you don't know. People are, you know, people make all kinds of judgments in our daily lives, right? And so when you start to tinker with the objectivity of how these decisions are made, you start to create all kinds of scenarios that could actually lead to killing more bears in the name of conflict reduction every year than we already are. And every single time we lose one of those bears, we are killing a threatened species in Alberta. And like, I don't like to dwell too much on our international and national reputation, but that is a thing that people see from the outside. They see Alberta is killing a threatened species. What kind of province is that? Who are we? Like, who are we as Albertans that we have listed? We have so few grizzly bears that they are listed as threatened, and we have a recovery plan to recover the population. And you know what recovery means? That we're trying to grow it, that there is more. You know, it's good. It's a good thing that there are more bears on the landscape now than there was in 2010 when bears were listed as threatened, because that actually means that the work that so many people are doing has been working, that we are recovering grizzly bears. It doesn't mean that we're done. It just means that what we're doing is working. And so now we want to send a message to the world that we're going to allow killing a threatened species. It's so wholly inappropriate, and it just conflicts with so many really basic wildlife management principles. And as somebody who's spent a lot of my career studying wildlife management and have had many pitchers of beer with other wildlife managers where we're sitting around solving all the world's problems, this is not an idea that is discussed. Nobody has ever said in any of those conversations, oh, we should just like let the public come in and kill problem bears. Like, it's so inappropriate. It really I don't know if you can tell, it kind of makes my blood boil a little bit.
Oh, you're not alone. I'm curious, and I swear this will be the last question that I ask before we get to the will it work part. Um, is there any part of the regulations that that say, hey, you're a fish and wildlife officer and you have a hunting license, you don't get to be a part of this lottery? Because that to me
So
would be the most basic kind of firewall that would be required to try to protect that objectivity. Because if that isn't part of the regulations, um, wow, this is like,
yeah, it's not part of the regulations, but I don't know if it's stated in the so like I said, my husband got emailed today. I didn't look at it in detail, but there's like an application form that you can fill out to be part of this pool of Alberta wildlife management people.
it
And it
includes
basically it
psychiatric
basically
assessment.
just asks for your hunter license number and make sure that you're over 18. Uh, I don't remember seeing anything about your profession or whatever. But that doesn't mean that that direction and guidance doesn't exist. That might be an internal directive that comes down from the deputy minister, the ADM, or even an executive director, like fish and wildlife officers, you cannot apply. So just because it's not in here doesn't mean that it doesn't exist somewhere else that we're just not aware of.
Boy, I really hope it
But you're
does.
right. You're right to question that. Like, that's a very good question, too. I mean, you have a lot of really great questions, Nate. I feel like you should probably write a letter to the minister and see if he has answers for you.
Um, they don't like me very much. Weight it would carry. We're still, I think we're almost a year into our requests for interviews with a couple of ministers as well as Daniel Smith, and they have not responded. I keep following up and being like, "Hey, did you lose the email?" I don't think it's a lost email
They're,
problem.
they're really busy.
Okay. So let's get to the question that I know you've been dying to answer for like the last half hour, and I keep going down rabbit holes. Um, is it going to work? Is this going to manage problem bears if these managers to death of bears with questionable proficiency don't make a problem bear more problematic? Um, will this work to manage the rate of problematic interactions? Like,
No. Simple answer, no. There has been, we kind of got some rumors that the government was thinking about opening the grizzly bear hunt, and we figured it was going to be in this line of conflict management somehow. And lots of jurisdictions are contemplating that, and so there has been some really recent research out of Ontario and also like Wisconsin. I want to say it was somewhere in the Northeast US. So I was at an international human bear coexistence workshop just a couple of years ago, and learning from all kinds of bear biologists and managers from all over North America that are dealing with these exact same challenges. And human bear conflict is a thing. I don't want to pretend like this isn't a problem that we need to address. It definitely is. But anyways, recent research out of Ontario really shows that when you use hunting as a management tool, that you can reduce conflict because you reduce the bear population, not because you're removing problem bears, right? So where you have in Ontario, where they have like really high densities of black bears, they actually showed that a spring hunt did not change the level of conflict incidents at all. It had no effect. Having a spring bear hunt did not change the number of conflicts, the intensity of incidences, anything. It was just like life went on as normal. In the Northeast US, where they also have really high density grizzly bear populations, they did find some mixed success with hunting as a conflict reduction tool, but only when they had so many hunting tags available that they really started to reduce the black bear population. And and then it was more a factor of just like, well, there's less bears on the landscape, so there's less bears getting into conflict because there's less bears on the landscape. What the grizzly bear recovery plan for Alberta recommends, and which all science really recommends, is working with people. So the best way to reduce human-bear conflict is to work with people to figure out the sources of the conflict and then to really address that at the source, right? So this is stuff like electric fencing chicken coops or electric fencing beehives. You can even think about how, like cattle ranchers can also think about how and where they move their cows across their massive ranches in certain times of year and whatever. Like there's also, we talked about dogs like Great Pyrenees and Karelian bear dogs that are really good at chasing bears off of property and protecting wildlife. There's been tons of success with some ranchers with using dogs for wildlife protection. When it comes to recreationists, it's really about being prepared, right? Like having your bear spray your dog on leash, hiking in a group, sticking to designated trails. Like all of these things all help us to reduce our conflict risk. And they're all things that we can control because we can't always control a bear, but we can always control what we as people are doing. And then there's also, you know, recognizing that there is risk and that nothing we will ever do will ever make that human bear conflict risk zero, right? And that can sometimes be really difficult to accept. But with all of this, the biggest thing is that killing problem bears does not reduce conflict because other bears will just come in to take advantage of that same attractant. So the two of the recommendations in the grizzly bear recovery plan that the government has not implemented is that there was supposed to be a provincial grizzly bear recovery coordinator who would be focused on bear management provincially and reducing conflict and populations and all this kind of stuff. So we're actually supposed to do an updated population estimate every 5 years, which we haven't done either. But then the other part of that was that the recovery plan recommended hiring a human bear coexistence specialist for each bear management unit. And that person would be responsible for going on the land and working with individual landowners, individual communities to identify attractants or things that might increase conflict risk, and then working with those landowners and those communities to reduce that. So that is really a person who's going to go to the cattle ranch and walk or ride the ranch with the rancher and be like, okay, here's the areas that are problematic from a bear's perspective. Here's some things that you can do. Like here's some things you could electric fence this, or maybe don't have your calves out here without supervision, or here's where you should really employ some dogs. Like these are all things that you can do as a landowner to reduce your risk. And the other part that the recovery plan recommends is that there's subsidies for those programs, so that if a rancher has to buy a whole bunch of electric fencing, that there's some financial support for a rancher to do that. And ultimately, the ranchers that I've spoken with and the people that live rurally that I've connected with, they don't want to kill a grizzly bear either, right? They just want to feel safe to go about their business. And so if they can have these other mechanisms in place that help keep them and their families and their livestock safe, then there's no need to kill a bear. Like that's what coexistence is. Coexistence is recognizing that we live on a landscape with carnivores, grizzly bears, wolves, cougars, black bears. We share a landscape with some pretty amazing wildlife. And coexistence is about how do we do that, and that still allows us to be us and for wildlife to be themselves. And at a community level, like Kenmore and Banff, we've done amazing things like bear-proof bins all over town and no outdoor compost. And, there's all kinds of bylaws around fruit trees and fruit tree replacement programs and all this kind of stuff. All of those things are about coexistence, and all of it really is about people changing our behavior so that we don't put a bear in an awkward position where it needs to be euthanized. We all need to remember here, Nate, bears are just being bears. They're going around the landscape. They're just trying to make a go of it. And if they find an attractive food source and it's quiet and there's not a lot of people there, well, they might like to eat it, and they're very food driven. And so the other part of this that the recovery plan also talks about is how we manage public lands around private lands. So if we have public lands that are just like crazy amount of motorized recreationists and crazy linear disturbance and lots of industrial activity happening all the time and recreation, and you think about what is happening on our Eastern Slopes public lands, and the list of human activities is long, right? There's people out there doing stuff all the time. And I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't be enjoying our wilderness. So don't let people think that. But if you're a bear and you've walked through, let's say from the national park, which was actually pretty chill, and you come out to an area like the Ghost, and the Ghost is full of people and full of stuff and activity and loud noises and things happening all the time. And if you just keep walking a little bit east, you get to this little cattle ranch, and oh, it's so quiet and there's no people here. And so the activity that we have on public lands can sometimes decrease habitat quality, making private lands more attractive, right? So this is now we're really starting to wade into really kind of fuzzy biological research, right? Because these things are really, really hard to quantify. But that's the reality of the landscape that Alberta grizzly bears are navigating every day, right? And so if you have a grizzly bear that just really is tired of being around people all the time and happens to wander onto a big piece of private land with no people, that bear ends up being more prone to becoming engaged in conflict, but it's really just trying to escape the madness that is happening in other parts of its territory, right? So if we can think about, if we can just take a step back sometimes to think about the bear's perspective and how we manage, we might manage bears a little differently. And this idea of just shooting bears, I think a lot of the time comes out of a place of fear, right? We're afraid of conflict bears, and our reaction is that we have to shoot it. We have to shoot it to protect ourselves, to protect our family, to protect our livestock, to protect our property. And it doesn't always solve the problem because you're not actually getting to the root of the problem, which is that bears need a lot of space, and we're reluctant to give it to them. And they like quiet, and we don't really want to give them that either. And then you have all this really great food in quiet, empty places, and we don't want bears to eat that either. So there you go. It's that complex rule book again, right? We've written this super complex rule book. We're like, here you go. Good luck.
But I love that you mentioned, because we talked about this a bit in the pre-interview. I had some thoughts on we should feel safe, and my reaction to that is no. You absolutely should not feel safe. If you are safe and comfortable in bear habitat, you're probably going to end up in a movie, and it might be called Grizzly Man, and you can fast forward to the end to see how that played out.
Well,
Um,
I don't know. I think there's a difference between feeling safe and feeling comfortable.
that's fair.
I have spent so much time in the Alberta backcountry. I don't even know how much. I've hiked most of the trails in Banff National Park, most of the ones in Kananaskis. I've been out on public lands. I feel safe out there because I'm prepared. I've got my bear spray. I looked online before I left the house to see if there's any bear warnings or area closures or things I should be aware about. I'm hiking and paying attention to the trail. I'm looking for fresh scat. Mark trees are kind of hard to decipher, but fresh scat is like if you find a big steaming pile and it's not a horse, it's probably a bear. You know, I'm making a lot of noise. I've got my dog on a leash. I'm with my friends. Like I've got my bear spray on my hip belt and not inside my pack. Like I feel safe in that moment. I feel like my chance of having a negative encounter with a bear is really, really low. But that doesn't mean that I'm comfortable. Like, so if I do run into a bear, I'm not going to be like, oh, yeah, it's all cool. It's all chill. You know, like if I run into a bear, I'm going to be like, huh, maybe we should not be here with this bear, unless it's at like a very far distance, like, you know, across a meadow or something. But if I run into a grizzly bear on a trail when I'm hiking, I might feel safe originally, but I don't feel comfortable. And, you know, I make every effort I can to get off of that trail or give that bear a lot of space so that it can go by and go about its business. Most of the time, bears, grizzly bears, black bears, they really don't want to have anything to do with us, right? Like they're just trying to get through the day. So if we can give them the space that they need to do that, you can have experiences with bears where, you know, nothing bad happens. And this is one of the ways that media, I think, when it comes to grizzly bears is really challenging because all of the times that I ran into a grizzly bear on the trail and I watched the bear and the bear watched me and then the bear went on its merry way and I went on my merry way. I mean, that doesn't make it into the newspaper. But the reality is that is the most common encounter with bears. Is like, I saw a bear and it saw me. And then, you know, he booked it and so did I. Like, whatever.
It almost seems to me, to use a clumsy metaphor, it's like walking along train tracks. If you're walking along train tracks and you're listening for the train and you know what the train schedule is and you're doing all of you feel the tracks every once in a while, you can safe ishly walk along train tracks. If you're walking along train tracks and you know you're on train tracks and you have your headphones on and you decide to lay down and have a nap, you've exponentially increased your risk. So there are risk mitigation things that you can do
Yes,
for just about anything. And
that's exactly it. And I think that the essence of human wildlife coexistence is that a lot of the work happens before the encounter occurs. So it's about the steps that you take at home before you leave the house to go hiking. It's about the things that you do as a landowner to secure your attractants. And I say landowner like big, small, whatever. Like, you know, I have this tiny little yard in Canmore. I very purposely planted no fruit trees. Like I do not have anything in my yard that a bear would be interested in eating. And that same mentality can go right up to like, you know, some of the biggest cattle ranches. Like you take steps on your land to reduce your risk. It doesn't mean that you eliminate it. And so that's the other part of this that is also in the grizzly bear recovery plan is a better livestock compensation program. So that when ranchers or other agriculturalists do lose livestock or bees to bears, grizzly bears or black bears, that there's a program in place that gives them confidence that they haven't lost their livelihood. And right now, the compensation program we have is decent, but it can definitely be improved. Every time I talk to a rancher about it, they've got tons of great ideas about how to improve the wildlife compensation program. And a lot of it comes down to having more fish and wildlife officers on the ground who can come and do assessments and conclusively prove that it has been a carnivore attack or a predatory attack on their livestock, so that they can be compensated appropriately. So, you know, I think that like we have programs in place, they need to be amplified. Bear Smart really needs like a massive boost. I think in one of the statements I saw the minister is like, we've put $100,000 towards Bear Smart. Bear Smart is like a website right now. You know, we need to have people who are running Bear Smart chapters in every single bear management unit who are working with communities to teach them about coexistence and to teach them what their options are and to help people learn to coexist. Bear Smart is a great program, but asking every single person who lives in bear country to go to a website online and then suddenly believe everything that's there, and adopt all of these recommendations, like that doesn't necessarily work, right? So, you know, $100,000 is not funding a provincial education program about coexistence. It just isn't.
Well, I mean, as you were saying that, I was quickly Googling because I wanted to make sure I got the number right. We're spending $100,000 on mitigating human bear conflict. See, I put the human part first because I learned something today. Uh, we're spending $100,000 mitigating for educational programs that mitigate
Yeah.
human bear conflict. We spent $8 million on a Tell the Feds program that accomplished nothing.
Yeah, and I mean, you can draw all kinds of parallels with that, right? Like our NDP opposition caucus has raised all kinds of question marks about millions of dollars. The UCP is very good at wasting money and picking fights. And in this particular case, they're wasting money creating these bear management authorizations, whatever. They're creating a whole new program that costs money. They're wasting money creating that, and they're picking a fight with Alberta Wildlife. And at the end of the day, Nate, there's also this huge economic argument to be made here, right? Like, do we want our eastern slopes to be about hunting and coal mining, or do we want our eastern slopes to be about tourism, nature appreciation, outdoor recreation? The reality is that tourism is growing. We have these huge objectives for tourism. Outdoor recreation is such a part of our cultural identity as Albertans, getting outside, appreciating our wilderness, appreciating where we are. It's who we are. And so that is the kind of tourist that we attract here. And that is an untapped potential, right? Like there is like so much economic benefit to be made from sharing our wilderness and our wild places with the world. And you know, the Bow Valley, we welcome 5 million people a year just to come and look at our mountains and our trees and our bears. And so do we really want to focus our eastern slopes on like hunting and coal mining? There's nothing wrong with hunting, but it's not the same as just encouraging people to get out and appreciate the wilderness that we have at our fingertips every single day.
Yeah. And I want to reiterate what you said there because I've made some comments about hunting. I want to make the clear delineation. When I'm being derogatory towards people who want to hunt big game for the experience, um, that is a totally different beast than somebody who's hunting to feed their family. They're harvesting animals responsibly. Those are two totally different things. And I'd be willing to bet if I could find a psychologist who could measure these things, if it's the same psychological profile, it's probably a radically different one. Um, because I, speaking anecdotally, it always seems like when these people who are into traveling to places and killing the big animals just so that they could say they did, when they make the news, it's almost always because there's also a story about how they're a horrible person. So do with that what
Well,
you
I'm
will.
not going to comment on that,
That's
but
fair.
I will say that, you know, like Alberta actually has a really thriving recreational hunting sector, right? And most of the animals that are hunted are used for meat.
Yep.
And that's already a big part of what we do, right? So we don't really need to add grizzly bears to that list of hunted animals. And, you know, like I said, my husband's a hunter and I'm appreciative of his efforts. And, you know, so this isn't about being against hunting.
No,
This is about not hunting a threatened species and not using hunting or killing as an excuse to manage conflict when it won't work.
exactly. So I wanted to say thanks for highlighting that because I think it's really important. I'm not anti-hunter in any way. I'm anti-jerk. Um, Anything else you want people to hear? Anything else you want to say? I mean, you've been incredibly generous with your time. I know I said 60 minutes and we've blown way past that. Uh,
Yeah. I mean, I'll
so
talk about bears all day long. Like I have lots left to say, but you know what? I'll just say this one last thing is that I was a little bit surprised today to see the email that my husband received as a hunter with a hunting license, inviting him to apply for one of these wildlife management authorizations or whatever. So I can only assume that that went out to every single person in Alberta with a hunting license today. And the reason why I'm surprised is because I felt like there had been quite a bit of public outcry since these changes in regulations were released and became apparent. It's been in the news every single day since then. But clearly, the minister has not heard from Albertans yet. And so I just really encourage people to email the minister and share their thoughts and perspectives about these changes in regulations. CC me as the opposition critic for environment and tourism. I really want to hear from Albertans too. And it doesn't matter what side of the issue you're on, like, please email me and let me know what you think, and email the minister, because I don't think he's heard from Albertans yet. Even though I know for a fact that he's received just under 1,000 emails, maybe more. But clearly that's not enough. So keep those messages coming. And I don't think that this should be an issue that that we as Albertans let go of too easily. This is a significant change, and there's a lot of reasons to be really concerned. Least of which, it's not going to work. It's not going to protect bears, and it's not going to protect people. It's just going to kill bears.
You know what I want to see? I want to see somebody start up a website, telltoddlowen.ca. Go format it. I think that would be delightful. I don't know how to do that.
Just throw that out there to the
Throwing that out to the ether.
Universe.
Um,
What I want to see, Nate? I want to see
grizzly bears.
No, I want to see political wildlife management decisions made based on science and data. That's what I want to see.
I would like to see all of the decisions based on science and data.
Oh yeah, I mean, aim high, like shoot for the sky. I'd love to see all decisions based on science and data too, for sure.
Let the smart people drive the bus for a while. I mean, like I feel like that's a great choice, or at least as you've said that, I was wondering if you listened to Sunday's show, because I did like an hour ranting about that in a completely moderately unhinged manner, but that's a whole other thing. Dr. Elmeligi, I want to thank you so much for the time that you've taken, for the passion that you bring to the conversation, and for the expertise, because we need to sell. And I'm not blowing smoke. This is a thing that I truly believe. We need to celebrate the smart people. And when the topics come up that the smart people have the expertise to talk on, we need to go, hey, you know about this thing, rather than me just pulling impressions out of the ether. What do you think? I don't think that's too much of a reach. So thank you so much for being willing to take the time to chat tonight.
Thank you so much, Nate. This has been wonderful. And I mean, like I said, I talk about bears anytime, any day of the week, all day long. I love it so much. And I really appreciate the opportunity to get more in depth, because there's a lot of complexity in this issue. So thanks so much for using this as a topic for your podcast. And I hope that people enjoyed themselves.
I have no doubts that there will be a good number of people who will.
Thank you so much.
And that's it for another episode of The Breakdown. As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here, we would love nothing more than if you thought about signing up to be one of our Patreon sponsors at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab, where for just the price of a fancy cup of coffee a month, you can help us continue to produce this kind of content. Whether you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, in which case maybe leave a review and a rating, or whether you're watching it on one of our streaming platforms, we want to say a big thank you to everybody who is part of the Breakdown's audience. And as always, take care of each other and keep the conversation going.